one of the things we sort of led to is the issue of safety, and I know Loretta, that's obviously something you focused on in a lot of ways. How safe is peroxide?
How safe is it in the patient's eye? Neutralized or
in the patient's hands? Just using it as a system. I mean, do you consider it a very safe system, or is the complexity make it less safe? Or
well, we've all had patients that used it in the wrong manner, perhaps even rinsed their lens with it, or a neighbor was over and used whatever was in their medicine cabinet and put the peroxide in their eye. We've all heard those stories. So in cases of non-compliance, you will get a transient up to 3-day probably ocular surface acute toxicity. Never have seen a major problem from that. Of course it's painful, and we'll get that phone call, and sometimes we don't even treat them anymore. We just talk through them on the phone, but they always get better. So, I mean, there's no long-term complications from putting it directly in your eye. But now, if used properly, how safe is it? Well, I've never seen a complication directly attributed to, the peroxide system itself. We can talk about infiltrates. I'm sure you're going to. They still occur with peroxide systems, but of course, they're minimized compared to multi-purpose solutions as a group. So it reduces to enough parts per million of residual peroxide that it's not toxic to the eye once it's neutralized and put back in properly. I am younger than you, but old enough to remember the days when you had to remember to let it soak in the 3% peroxide for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, I can't remember the time, and then you had to add the neutralization. So there were many times that patients did forget that step years ago.
No question, it did happen, and I think there were a lot of people who comment that peroxide is inherently not safe because it requires patient interaction, and frankly, I found it over the years to be as safe as any other product. I think your point is well put. It's as safe as the patient allows it to be. If a patient doesn't pay attention, they can get themselves in trouble. In contrast, practicing for most of my life in New York, I found that a little bit of a sting wasn't that big an issue, and because peroxide neutralizes pretty much whatever it comes in contact with, from a biocidal perspective, they essentially sterilize their eye when they make that mistake. So
I call it a gentle giant.
That's a good way of putting it.
That's how I refer to it sometimes with my patients. It's strong, but it's gentle when it's used properly.
Yeah.
Kind of like Rick Weidbart.
A gentle giant. Well, that's a good way of putting that too, Chris. So since you volunteered, what problems have you seen with peroxide from a technical point of view? Have you seen any? And what solutions have you come up with? Have you come up with any unique solutions in terms of ensuring compliance and making sure patients are following your directions?
Who are you
Kristen.
Okay, well, sometimes peroxide is maybe not appropriate for certain, say, prosthetic lenses. There may be some issues with some laminated lenses, for example. So it isn't necessarily appropriate for every single lens that's on the market, but for the vast majority of what we consider normal and lenses, it works quite well for. That's kind of what line you're going for there?
Oh, no. In other words, there's no such thing as a perfect product. Every single product has an issue. And I'm just curious as to whether or not, in fact, Chris, you're nodding, whether you've encountered issues that you've overcome through patient instruction or strategy.
Sure. Thanks, Art. I think what's really on the front of the mind of the patient as well as the practitioner is neutralization. I think that's really the biggest question because of the patients that both Loretta and Mile mentioned who have accidentally put hydrogen peroxide that's not very well neutralized on their eye, and it's not very comfortable, and it's not great in terms of the way it looks and feels. I think in designing a product for human use and or human consumption, responsibility in that design is very critical and very key. And one of the things that there's been some very nice science looking at is how this translation from 3% hydrogen peroxide gets reduced, so when this lens is put on the eye, a count in parts per million of remaining peroxide, what is it? And I think ClearCare, the design has been very, very responsible in that it's been so low that we really have not encountered a lot of adverse reactions on the eye due to what could be the opposite, where some products can come to market or have been on market where the parts per million is significantly greater than that. And it can be subclinical, it can be clinically obvious, neither one being good for the patient.
That's a great point. We have almost a responsibility to ensure the lowest residual peroxide when the patient uses this product. Loretta, you were going to make a comment?
Well, not on that point, but on the previous point of you asked, like, what problems have we seen with peroxide?
Okay.
There's definitely patients I avoid peroxide with. One is the occasional user, because as the peroxide gets converted or neutralized, as you said, to relatively non-preserved product, then certain organisms that can survive the cycle, because they, as you guys have mentioned, organisms can produce catalase and peroxidases as well, so they can survive a cycle. And they can grow up over time. So if a patient is a weekly wearer, I don't recommend peroxide, because when they go to put that lens in, you might be surprised at the organisms that are found on that lens. So they're better multipurpose users. There's also certainly the patients that we see in our practice that we would never even ask them to use peroxide, and I'm sure you can all name a few. You just worry about their compliance. Even some peroxide users top off. So if you've got the patients that are skimping on products, and you already know that, probably peroxide is not the best for them.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And in fact, non-compliance is not limited to any one system or any one product. And there are certainly patients that you can spot from a mile away once you have a little bit of experience that you treat with kid gloves, because you know they're going to not listen to whatever it is that you suggest. Yes, Mila.
Could I just add something to the compliance perspective? I think those are great points too. One of the things we do in our practice, and we try and do this just to minimize any of the adverse events, which is really going to happen if somebody does what they're supposed to do with the peroxide system, it will work as a good system. So what we do is two things. We educate them in the exam room, and that's where I start talking to them about the system and just the fact that it's different, and you're going to have to follow some very specific instructions that are a little bit different than what you might have been using. But that message is actually reinforced before they leave the office with one of my technicians, where they go over very specifically exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and most importantly, they actually leave with a sample of it so they can practice it before it's actually time for them to go to the store shelves and purchase it.
You realize, just as a note to the to whoever is going to be compiling this, we're sort of flitting around between practice management and other sections, so just so that you're aware of that when you're transcribing. We will rearrange, so not to worry. But that's okay. That's okay. You know, I think.
I have a question for Mile.
Yeah.
Mile, that was you, right? Who just said that?
That's Chris
Yeah.
Sint.
Yeah, it is, Chris.
Okay. So going back to exactly what you said,
Yep.
you know, your staff spends a lot of time going through how peroxide works, why they shouldn't put it directly into their eye, how to use the system. Do you think in your practice you spend relatively more time having your staff explain peroxide to your patients and how to use it than they spend using a multi-purpose type solution? And do you think that probably plays into the compliance a little bit more? Because I too find that patients using a peroxide system tend to be a little more compliant to the system, but it may be because I've driven compliance home to them a little bit stronger.
Yeah, Chris, great question. So my staff members don't actually talk to them about the mechanism and how it works. They talk to them about the importance of doing what they're supposed to be doing so that everything gets neutralized, but they don't really go into some of the specifics.
The mechanism of the container.
Yeah. Most of it actually isn't that much longer than discussing multi-purpose solutions. The one reason why I would say yes, just a little bit, is because they'll physically take it out, and we have a ClearCare container, and even in the exam room, so that they actually are taking it out of the trial kit and showing it to the patient, which they don't necessarily do with the multi-purpose solutions when they're actually describing it to them. So it does take maybe just a little bit more time, but it's because we're going into the box and physically showing them the case and how it's different.
That's a good point.
it may be more extensive, or
It probably is just because it's a different system, so it requires a different container to actually take care of the contact lenses.
All right.
I think there's a mental image that people have of hydrogen peroxide. They have used it to disinfect their countertops. They've used it for different things, like, they get a wound and they put hydrogen peroxide on it, and so they know that it's powerful stuff. And I think if you warn them that if they get that in their eye, I mean, it's not going to kill them, but it may make them want to die. And the other,
do you tell that to your patients? You may want to die.
we actually tell them, we say, if you get this in your eye, I said, there's a reason we use it. It kills bacteria very thoroughly, but if it gets into your eye, it will damage the cells on your eye exactly the same way. We're talking about the safety of the system. The other thing that someone mentioned is about topping off. I find that to be very. There's the only way you can tell if a patient is lying is if their lips are moving. But by and large, you can sort of tell if people. You have them bring your case and you have a condition. You ask them open-ended questions to find out if they are topping off. And we find that a lot of the people that develop infiltrates, in fact, that's their problem, is topping off. But I think that people are almost afraid to top off with peroxide. I mean, what would they put in there? They just add extra peroxide?
And yet a surprising number of people